Well, thank you again, Deborah, for the invitation to speak, and thank you for all coming. It's nice to be back in Canada and to covet a cup of my relative and namesake's Tim Hortons coffee. As you can see, my talk will be about First Nations, or in the context of the time period, Canadian Indians, and the First World War. And this is a very large topic, and I'm only given a short period of time to talk. So feel free in question time to ask anything I don't cover or aspects of my talk that I skim over, if you will. I started my research and writing my books on this topic long before my friend Joseph Boyden's 3-Day Road came out, but I should thank him for his wonderfully accessible and mainstream contribution to literature, which really dispelled the myth of the forgotten warrior approach that has plagued First Nations' involvement in military history. And also for appealing to such a large audience and putting First Nations, specifically First World War military history, on the radar in Canada. And if you have not read Joseph Boyden's 3-Day Road, I strongly recommend it. It's a fantastic book based on two Cree snipers in the First World War, loosely based on the real-life story of Corporal Francis Pegamagabo, who won the military medal 3 times and has an unofficial tally of 378 kills. At the outbreak of war, the 103,000 status Indians in Canada were not citizens, were not enfranchised, were wards of the state, and were subject to all the tenets of the Indian Act, which included pass laws, alcohol laws, employment laws, and certainly the Indian Affairs assistance on residential schooling and farming and religious education, the Bible and the plow. When war breaks out, there's confusion immediately within government departments and ministries as whether status Indians or First Nations are allowed to exist. So 2 days after the outbreak of war, Sir Sam Hughes, our controversial, to say the least, Minister of Militia, issues this statement. This becomes the unofficial statement. There's no official statement regarding the enlistment of Indians, as they had served in the militia prior to the war. So this becomes the unofficial statement of exclusion that is used by the Department of Justice, the Ministry of Militia, and the Department of Indian Affairs. However, because it is unofficial, some First Nations men slip through the cracks, like Corporal Francis Pegamagabo, who enlists in the 1st Battalion right at the outbreak of war and is part of the 1st Canadian contingent. So he survives the war and serves just as long as any other Canadian soldier. It wasn't until the War Office, the war's not over by Christmas, it's dragging on. It wasn't until the War Office demands, remember, the United Kingdom still controlled Canadian foreign and military policy. It demands of the British Dominions, including Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Newfoundland, that we need everybody we can get, so you need to enlist your Indigenous men. Shortly after this memorandum, on December 4th, the Canadian government finally issues an official declaration that First Nations men are allowed to enlist. It's no longer a white man's war, and that is certainly increasing as we go through the war with Chinese coolies and colonial Africans, the Maori, Aboriginal Australians, and Indigenous people from all over the empires of France and the United Kingdom. The best example of this change in policy is Enos Kick, who's an Oneida from the Green Bay Reservation, literally right beside the Green Bay Airport. He and his brother Albert try to enlist prior to the change in policy, and they're turned away by recruiters in London, Ontario, as he says, on account of being Indian. So after the change in policy, they enlist again. They travel to the Oneida settlement just outside London, Ontario, leave their families at Oneida, and enlist in the Middlesex Battalion together. Why enlist? You're wards of the state. You have no rights in Canada. Obviously, prior to the war, there was a global recession, which included Canada. So a lot of First Nations men, like their Canadian counterparts, enlisted for employment and adventure. Obviously, the recession and the socioeconomic standing of First Nations at this time was far less than other Canadians. So it was a chance to gain employment and adventure and send some money home. The second one is escape from the reserve in the Indian Act. Once outside the reservation, or reserve, been in the United States too long, as they call them, reservations. The reserve, there was the belief that joining the Army was an escape from the tenets of the Indian Act and all the laws that barred Aboriginal people from doing things in Canada. The warrior status, you have to remember that the 1885 rebellion was not that long before the outbreak of war, and it still resonated with Native peoples in the West. The warrior status ethos had not vanished with Native peoples, and this was a chance for their young men to gain status within their communities as warriors, as is customary in most First Nations cultures and traditions. Allegiance to the crown. In the West, the numbered treaties were signed under the name of Queen Victoria. So looking at the correspondence from a lot of those Native nations in the West, you see that they feel a direct allegiance to the crown and immediately offer men and money to the war effort to the crown. Secondly, the military allegiance of many First Nations in the East, the largest one, or the most prominent one, being the Six Nations Haudenosaunee-Iroquois Confederacy, had a long-standing allegiance with the British Crown throughout colonial wars. So again, they offer men and money immediately at the beginning of the war to the British Crown, not to the Canadian government. And lastly, to gain equal rights. And you again see this through the correspondence from Aboriginal chiefs or individual soldiers, that they thought if they shared equally in the horrors and burdens of war, that they would be able to gain equal rights within Canadian society. After sanction was given December 4th, 1915 to enlist, Native men, Aboriginal men rushed to recruiting depots for all the reasons that I previously mentioned. I should say in equal numbers as other Canadians per capita. The sacrifice, as I said, the total population of status Indians in 1914 was just over 103,000, 103,337 to be exact. Over 4,000 status Indians, this doesn't include Inuit or non-status Indians or Métis. Over 4,000 status Indians served in the Canadian Expeditionary Force, which represents 35% of Aboriginal men of military age, which is equal, as I said, per capita to the rest of Canada, or to Anglo-Canadians. We know that at least 300 were killed and another 1,200 wounded. This is slightly lower than the overall number for the Canadian Expeditionary Force, and it's simply because they were allowed to join the war fairly late. They weren't subject to conscription. Well, they were, and then they weren't. And also, a lot of them were used in forestry corps and labor battalions as well, so they weren't on the front lines fighting, so their casualty rates are slightly less. The most notable Aboriginal soldier of the First World War is Corporal Francis Pegamogabo, who won the military medal 3 times and tallied the war's record, but it is unofficial, of 378 kills. Unlike most snipers, they worked in pairs, a shooter and a spotter. He chose to snipe alone, so we're basing that number on his honesty and his word, which I suspect is probably close to being true based on his accolades received and medals. Finally, this myth of the forgotten warrior ethos is starting to be dispelled. As you see, in 2006, Corporal Francis Pegamogabo, the 3rd Canadian Ranger Patrol Group building was named after him. And also, right out the front door of the Lord Elgin, is the National Aboriginal Veterans Memorial, which was dedicated on Aboriginal Day in 2001. The Canadian Forces, First Nations are well represented in the Canadian Forces to this day, and I know going into the future they will continue to serve the shared interests of our national forces. Megwich, merci, thank you.